Hello, and welcome to Unit 4, the unit on identity and the philosophy of mind. Now, one of the reasons I like to record these lectures is because sometimes the book makes some decisions that I think I certainly would have made otherwise. This doesn't make it a bad book, but nothing's perfect, and so I do like to point some extra things out. And in this case, there's a few things I'd like to say about this particular unit, and so here we go. The first thing about this particular unit that does quite distress me a lot, I'm not real happy about it, is that there are two distinct issues covered in this unit, and the unit really mushes them together, sort of treats them as if they're the same thing when they really are not. The two issues that are covered in this chapter, and they sort of start with, the book starts with one issue, and then goes to another issue, and then it goes back to the first one. Again, I'm not real happy about that, but those two issues are first, the issue of personal identity, and second, the nature of the mind. So it actually starts out talking about the nature of the mind, and then talks about personal identity for a while, and then goes back to talking about the nature of the mind. And so we'll cover where that split off happens. And the thing that's a little annoying about this is that the personal identity is really a different question than the nature of the mind. And while it might seem like those two questions are closely related, they are similar to each other. They do tread over similar ground, but you don't, since they are different questions, different issues, your views on one of those issues does not necessarily mean anything about your views on the other issue, right? So your views about personal identity don't have to say anything, don't mean that you have to have certain views about the nature of mind. And your views about the nature of mind don't necessarily mean you have to have a particular view about personal identity. So they are largely independent. And so they really shouldn't be smooshed together. So I'm going to try and straighten that out a little bit. So the issue in personal identity is this. It's the issue of what makes a person the same person over time and through change. And so it might not have occurred to you, probably has not occurred to you, that it's a little weird that people do this thing that they do. So someone might show you a photograph and say, hey, that's me when I was 8. And again, probably nothing seems strange about this, but that's philosophy for you, is that when you really look at a lot of the ordinary things we do, you find some strangeness in it. So let's take a look at that example. Here we have a photograph of what may well be an 8-year-old Ludwig Wittgenstein, and on the right you have a Wittgenstein who's, I would guess, in his 30s. I'm not exactly sure when either photograph was taken. I probably could have looked it up, but it doesn't really matter. The idea is that they're both photographs of the same person, right? So when we're saying that the thing on the left and the thing on the right are the same thing, right? That there's an identity relation between them. Now, what could we possibly mean by that? This is what I mean by you might not have ever occurred to think of problems with this claim. Well, look, physically, he's very different, right? As are we all. I assume none of you look like you looked when you were 8, unless you looked like really freakish 8-year-olds. Look, I'm sure you look perfectly normal now, but if you looked as an 8-year-old like you look now, that would be very abnormal for an 8-year-old. Look, I'm sure you're very physically different than you were when you were 8. And honestly, you might say, okay, well, look, but I have the same, psychology or the same mind or something like that. Well, I mean, I don't think that's true either. Most people do not think the same way as adults as they do when they're 8. Again, if you do, I'm very sorry. There is a lot of psychological difference as well. And so with all of these differences and, with the vast number of changes one goes through over the years, it does start to get a little peculiar. In what sense do we mean that the person in one photograph is the same as the person in the other? That is, what does actually make a person the same over time and through change? And we'll see a couple of different perspectives on that. One that's going to focus on the body and another that's going to focus on mental properties. But that's one issue, right? What is it that makes a person the same over time and through change? Once we go over to this other issue, this issue of the nature of the mind, we're asking a different question. We're asking, what is the mode of existence of the mind? That is, what is a mind? What kind of thing is it? Because we don't tend to doubt that minds exist. If you doubt that a mind exists, you've already lost it, because if it doesn't, what are you doubting with? Okay. But there is a real question, what kind of a thing is a mind? What does it mean to say that you have one? How do we know what kinds of things do have minds or can have minds, right? There's a lot of questions in this area. Some of the answers to this question that we're going to take a look at include this one, that It's its own distinct substance. There's a kind of mind stuff, and that's what a mind is, right? That's the mode of its existence. Another answer says, well, look, there's not any physical mode of existence that a mind is. A mind is an abstraction, right? It's a thing that is real enough, and we talk about it, and it has real properties, but it's not part of, as you might say, the furniture of the universe, right? Something like the equator, right, is a real thing, right? There's not any sort of matter of dispute, and it's not arbitrary. You can't put the equator wherever you want it. It's the thing that is exactly parallel to the rotation of a spheroid body, right? And so there's no dispute as to where the equator is, but it's all the same an abstraction. It's not a physical thing, right? You don't hold the equator or smell the equator or something like that. To some degree, you can stand on it, but you're standing on the ground, right? Like I said, so it's an abstraction. That's one thing you can say about the mind, is it's a kind of abstraction that describes behaviors, right? So a mind is a set of behaviors. That's another view. You can also say, no, 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 a mind just is a brain. Okay, that's people often talk this way these days, but that's another theory of what a mind is. Or you can say it's a different kind of abstraction. Instead of one that describes behaviors, you can say it's an abstraction that describes functions, right? We'll get to what a function is in some detail a little bit later. So first, let's talk about personal identity. Let's talk about this one. Uh, Again, the chapter starts by talking about a theory of mind, and then starts talking about a couple of notions of personal identity, and then goes back to talking about theories of mind. So we're going to separate those two, and we're going to deal with personal identity first, because only two of the authors in this unit really talk about personal identity. And so when we ask about personal identity, we're asking what kind of thing is a person? In some sense, you might say, what mode of existence do persons have, or something like that. But really, we're saying, what is this? And there are a couple of very popular perspectives on this. One of those very popular answers is an answer that we sort of intuitively use all the time. We say a person is a live human body, right? Or a person is their body. This is also called bodily identity theory. Okay, and so we say that a person is a set of bodily properties, or the continuity of a body. And what we mean by continuity of a body is something like this. Again, go back to the example about somebody when they were 8. Well, the day they turned 8, their body was a certain way, and the day after that, it was really, really similar. And the day after that, it was similar to the day before, etc., until you get to now. Now, all of those small changes over time have added up to large changes if you sort of really, look at the spectrum. But there is still this continuity. There's this kind of day to day, it's always sort of been here, and the change has been very gradual. And so people tend to think that objects, and bodies are objects, can survive gradual change, that is, the identity can persist. One classic example of this is something like a ship, where you can imagine sailing it around for a while, and after a while you might change off the hull plating, or change out pieces of the deck as they wear out, change out a rope here or there, change out a sail here or there, change out a part of this, a piece of that, and eventually you've got a very, very different boat than one you started with, but the change was gradual. That is, it's still in some sense, right, and in an important sense, the same boat, right? That's a question of of object identity, and we can say that for persons. I mentioned just a few minutes ago that people often use this without knowing that they're using it. Well, think about it this way. When your friend promises to meet you at some restaurant, how do you know that you've found your friend? Most of the time, we don't devote any actual time to thinking about this issue. We just sort of do this instinctively, or on autopilot. But let's do it on purpose. Let's say, how do you know that you found your friend under those circumstances? Well, really, what most people do is they look around and see if they can locate their friend's body based on what it looked like the last time they saw it, right? And then when you found your friend's body, you generally don't have any doubts that you have in fact found your friend, right? And so we very often use the bodily criterion in everyday life. But of course, it's not the only way to define what kind of a thing a person is. You might say instead, what's really essential to a person is these mental properties, right? These psychological properties. Saying that a person, right, is a mind, okay, is known as the psychological identity theory. And notice we sometimes use this one in everyday life as well. Right. So, for example, imagine you get a text message from somebody. Maybe you get a new phone and you haven't like updated the phone book or something like that. And so you get a message from somebody and it's just a number, right? Their name is no longer attached to it, so you don't know who it's from. And so you talk to them a little bit. Now, of course, you could just cheat. You could say, "Hey, who is this?" Right? But sometimes if you feel like that's a little too unfamiliar, or people might have their feelings hurt or something like that. Most of the time you can just say, "Hey, look, I got a phone. I don't know whose name this is. Please tell me." But the other thing you can do is you can try and guess, right? You can have context clues and make sort of non-committal replies until you're like, no, 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 no. This person is talking about X, Y, and Z. That must mean they're, Mitch or somebody, right? And so the idea is that based on the way that they respond in a kind of question-answer game, right, where the psychological properties or the psychology of a person is all you really have access to, that might be how you might identify somebody. And so, again, that's referred to as a psychological identity theory. And in all of our sort of ordinary life, the trouble is that both of these things they're intertwined. Uh, in that, generally speaking, humans get one mind apiece, right? And then that's the one they got their whole time, and they got one body apiece, and that's the one they keep the whole time. And so, sort of actual human life doesn't provide us with a lot of opportunities for separating these two things, for determining which one is actually correct. But notice, only one of them can, in fact, be correct. We can be a set of bodily properties, or we cannot essentially be a set of bodily properties. We can be essentially psychological, or we can be not essentially psychological, right? And if we're essentially one, we're that then by definition not essentially the other, right? So a question of essence here is it's binary, right? It's like the law of excluded middle making trouble for us again, and so again they can't both be true even though they both are quite plausible. So people argue about them. And here's how people argue about these kinds of issues. Again, the issue itself is not a matter of opinion. Right? Philosophical questions in general are not matters of opinion. They aren't simply decided by what one person thinks or what another person thinks. Right? They're decided by, there are actually facts involved here. They're just facts that are really, really hard to ascertain, or in some cases even impossible to ascertain, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to make good intellectual progress on them. So one of the things we do with issues in metaphysics is we use what are called thought experiments. And what these aren't just sort of sitting in an armchair saying, well, I kind of think it would be this way, or I kind of think it would be that way. That's a very lazy way to go about things. You don't make any progress that way. Instead, you say, all right, let's think about this idea in this particular way. Right? Let's put it into a situation, right? And let's see how much sense that situation makes. Or let's see if we can start with an idea and show that it's actually contradictory, or that it's actually circular when you think about it in a particular way, or put it into a certain situation, right? That's what a thought experiment is for. It's supposed to illustrate a kind of problem with thinking one way as opposed to thinking another way. Right? It's a kind of test, just like an experiment is really looking to falsify a particular, like I said, an experiment in science is trying to falsify a particular point of view. It says, well, look, if this is really true, then this shouldn't happen. We should see this instead of that, and so then you check, right? That's what scientists tend to do in their experiments. And I mean, this experimental method is something that science got from philosophy. So the reason that we use the method is because it simply makes sense. And so one of the oldest and most classic ways of thinking about bodily versus psychological identity theories is to talk about switching brains and bodies around. You take, person A's brain and put it in person B's body, or take person B's body and put it in and around person A's brain. And the way you describe this case actually tends to reveal which theory you're already getting. This is why I've sort of written here brain/body transplants. So here's the thing. If what happens when you have a brain swap is that you keep your body and you get somebody else's brain, that assumes the bodily identity theory, right? Your identity stays with your body and you just get a new brain, right? And so that's what we call a brain transplant. Most of the screenwriters actually get this one wrong. They call the other thing a brain transplant. So what often happens in the movies, right, if you sort of have people switch brains, is what happens is their identity goes along with the brain. Well, that assumes a psychological identity theory, assuming that the brain has, something to do with our psychologies. And so that's what you call a body transplant, right? That is, you stay with your brain. That's where the identity stays, and then you get a new body, right, to go with that brain. Okay, and so whether it's a brain or a body transplant really depends on what theory of identity you have. And that's an interesting thing about these kinds of cases is that even if they really happened, we'd still be arguing about the metaphysical issue. Even if we did swap two people's brains or swap two people's bodies, however you want to describe it, we'd still have a fight about what the best way to describe it was. And this point is made best by a guy named John Perry, a philosopher who tells this story about a senator and a lobbyist. And I'll just sort of relate the story briefly. So he, starts off with really the classic scenario where, this lobbyist wants to take over the body of a senator to go and vote a certain way on a bill that means a lot to his interest group. And so he convinces his brother, who's a brain surgeon, to come in and help. And so in the middle of the night, they sneak into this senator's room, and then they do the brain, the body transplant is really what they're trying to do. They're trying to get the lobbyist the senator's body, right? And thus they're going to get him to be able to masquerade as the senator, right, in the senator's body, and really be the lobbyist instead and vote the way they would vote. And so, of course, the senator, wakes up, and he wakes up in the lobbyist's body, and it's very confusing. And then he learns of this evil plan and is dismayed, right? But then John Perry says, okay, everybody, not so fast. This might be what a Hollywood screenwriter would do. That may be their essential assumption where they'd start with. But really, haven't we been misdescribing the case? Perhaps what's going on is that the senator goes to sleep, and then he wakes up having acquired delusions of having used to been a lobbyist, right? He believes he used to be a lobbyist because he has this lobbyist's brain in his head, but of course that's not true, right? If you do a DNA test, fingerprints, the testimony of all of his family and friends, you look at the security camera on previous Senate meetings, they're like, no, that's the senator, right? If he thinks he used to be a lobbyist, well, he's wrong. He didn't used to be a lobbyist. He's always been the senator, at least since the time he was elected. It's just that since somebody did a brain surgery on him, well, of course they altered his psychological properties. It's a lot like this. Imagine somebody is in a very bad auto accident and has a brain injury that changes their personality. We don't say it's a different person, but we do say their personality has changed. At least we don't say that in the sense that, now their driver's license is invalid, right? We don't know who they are anymore. If it was your brother, you still describe them as your brother, all that sort of stuff, right? We say, yes, they're different now, right? But we don't say that they are a different person in the sense of identity now. And so, again, that's one of those things where these sort of brain-body transplant cases don't actually settle much. And so you have to get a little bit more creative. One particular person who gets pretty creative is a guy by the name of Richard Hanley. He wrote a book called The Metaphysics of Star Trek, a couple of chapters of which are exploring the personal identity issue using beaming as an example. And I'll let you sort of look those up if you're really interested. Another sort of a little more easily accessible way to take a look at people who've done little thought experiments to think about what personal identity is or isn't is the philosopher Daniel Dennett, who's been mentioned before and will be mentioned again. And so this is a little YouTube thing of a bit of a documentary about a very interesting episode in Daniel Dennett's life. And so I noticed from this video, you can't really sort of link to part 1, part 2, and part 3, but you can search for in YouTube, which you're already on if you're watching this, Dennett gets his brain removed. That's Dennett, gets his brain removed. And you can look at part 1, part 2, and part 3 of that video. Or you can look at the link accompanying this. I'm linking the PowerPoint along with posting the link to the video. And you can open the PowerPoint and click on these hyperlinks and it'll take you straight there, whichever you think is easier. Probably easier just to search for it on YouTube, which you're already on. But that presents, again, some interesting and sort of entertaining thought experiments about personal identity, whether it's psychological or whether it's bodily, or whether those theories might both be mistaken, and some other theory of identity might actually be a correct one. So the first theory of personal identity that the text talks about is Locke's theory of identity. There's a portrait painted of Locke. It's one of his more famous portraits. It's got very sort of stylish hair. The styles do come and go. Locke published his most famous work in the 1600s. Some of it in the early 1600s. He's most well known for his political writing, which we'll actually take a look at in Unit 5. But for now, he's well known for his work in metaphysics and epistemology. And he's sort of a giant in philosophy, right? He writes a lot of stuff on a lot of important issues. Now, before we get into his view on personal identity, I did want to mention something that the text said that really sort of got my goat. It really bothered me. It said that Locke, like Descartes, had a very scientific worldview. The reason that bugs me is because it kind of gets it backward. Okay, Locke and Descartes were both very heavily responsible for what turned into early modern science, and early modern science was largely based on the insights and the work of people like Descartes and people like Locke. In fact, one of Locke's central claims to fame in philosophy is being really the first modern empiricist. Okay, remember, empiricism is the view that you get knowledge about the world only through the senses. Okay, that's a view in philosophy, a very prominent view. And in fact, if you look at an earlier lecture, that's one of the central assumptions of the scientific method is empiricism. And Locke is the first person to really define and defend empiricism in the modern era. And this is another thing. Philosophy is so old that we call the modern era roughly the period of time from the 1500s until the 1800s. So Locke, it's more accurate to say that scientists take a Lockean view of the world than it is to say that Locke takes a scientific view of the world. But enough about that. Let's talk about his theory of identity. And Locke is going to offer us a very early version of the psychological identity theory. It's certainly not the only version, but it's a very popular version, and it shares a lot of similarity with modern versions of the theory. One of the things he does is he defines identity as consciousness. Now, you got to be careful with these sorts of things, because if you look at that really carefully, you would say, okay, great, identity is consciousness. Well, the natural question is, what's consciousness, right? It seems like you've replaced one difficult to define concept with another even more difficult to define concept. So that may not count as progress. And so the rest of what Locke does sort of is to flesh that out. He defines consciousness in terms of what we now call metacognition. Now, he doesn't use that phrase, but that's the phrase we now use to describe what he describes. Metacognition is thinking about thinking, right? Or being aware of thinking. That's all he defines as consciousness. It's a very narrow definition, and it's not mystical in any way, right? A lot of times people have very mystical definitions of consciousness, or very expansive and wishy-washy, or what they do is they define consciousness in terms of other things that they then don't define, right? There's a lot of soup involved in people's discussions about consciousness, and so philosophers tend to be very, very careful about defining their terms well. And so Locke defines consciousness in terms of metacognition, that is, thinking about thinking. And it's interesting here that this is independent of any of our particular philosophies of mind or theories of mind that we'll take a look at, because Locke himself is entirely agnostic about the source of consciousness. He doesn't care where it comes from or what its essential nature is. He just says, look, it's metacognition. When you're aware of the fact that you're thinking, or when it feels like a certain thing to be thinking, that's consciousness. That's all he means. Right? And he says that's what identity is. What makes a person the same person over time is that there's this constant awareness of their thinking over time. Right? The idea is that you're aware that you're thinking the whole time that you're thinking and feeling and all that sort of stuff. So if Descartes is right, and you've got, what the mind is this sort of mind stuff, great. That's what causes consciousness. Well, that's what identity is that consciousness. If something else causes consciousness, fine. Identity is still the consciousness, right? And so again, he's entirely agnostic about where consciousness comes from or what its nature is. He just sort of says, look, the bare fact of consciousness is the thing that grounds identity over time. It's a very straightforward psychological identity theory. The second author that the text gives us a look at is this fella here. That is David Hume. He was a Scotsman from Scotland's greatest city, Edinburgh. Went to the University of Edinburgh, and actually to this day, some of the best Hume scholars that there are study at or work at the University of Edinburgh. Hume is, like Locke, an empiricist, and so just for the purposes of bar trivia, if anybody asks you who the big three British empiricists are, the answer is John Locke, George Berkeley, who we don't really read in this particular course, in this particular book. And the word Berkeley, it's spelled Berkeley like the city in California, but pronounced Barkley like the former NBA player. That's a British thing. And the third is David Hume. So John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume are the big three British empiricists. Remember, an empiricist is someone who believes that you gain knowledge only from the senses. And that's very important for Hume's approach here, because what Hume is going to do is he's going to simply deny that John Locke's theory of personal identity, this psychological identity or identity as consciousness theory, can possibly be correct. Hume is going to give us a refutation. Another thing about Hume is he's probably the most important philosopher ever to have written in English. He wrote a wide range of topics, was very influential, has some fantastic ideas. In fact, you've probably got a lot of ideas now, things that you just consider common sense, but they're things that Hume probably came up with or heavily influenced during this period in time. He also had a huge effect on English writing style. A lot of people credit him with inventing the essay as a format of English writing. And it's actually a little too bad that the text doesn't give you more of his writing, because it's really fantastic. He's got a wonderful, beautiful English style, a very, very good writer. So in any case, Hume is going to refute John Locke's theory of identity as consciousness, and the way he's going to do it is by doing what he usually does, is by paying very, very close attention to what it is that we actually experience. Again, remember, empiricism is the view that you only get knowledge through the senses. All knowledge is gained through the senses, and that means that whatever you actually experience is going to be what you have to rely on, and so he's going to pay very close attention to what we actually experience. And so here's how his refutation of Locke's view goes. Remember Locke's view. Locke's view says that we're conscious, right? That means we think about our thinking, or we sort of feel ourselves thinking or experiencing things, and that continuity of consciousness, the fact that it's always there, is that's what we are. That's what our identity is. It doesn't really matter where consciousness comes from or how it arises or anything like that, but the consciousness is what makes our identity hold over time. Well, Hume wants to say, not so fast there, Mr. Locke. We don't have any uniformity or continuity of actual experience. Right? So he uses his language. He says there's no single impression that exists the whole time. And by impression, he means some piece of experience, something that you actually feel. So, for example, when you're happy, you feel happy. When you're sad, you feel sad. When you're angry, you feel angry. When you're asleep, you don't feel anything. Okay. When you're under anesthetic for surgery, same story there. And so our experience is not uniform at all. You can't move your eyes around in your sockets without completely changing the experiences you're having. And so there's no sameness, really, right? Of course, you're having experiences. You may be aware that you're having them as long as you're having them, but what you're having is just not consistent from one time to another, or from one place to another. And also, of course, with sleep and unconsciousness and various kinds of things, we don't have a continuity of consciousness either. There's all sorts of gaps and holes. And so Hume's point is going to be that, look, if you want identity to be uniform and continuous, which by definition it has to be, identity says you're the same person at every moment all the way through your life. Well, there's no experience that's the same every moment all the way through your life. And there's also just the bare fact of consciousness, in addition to the fact that it doesn't feel the same the whole time. It's not there the whole time. You are sometimes unconscious. So Locke's view looks like it's going to have to fall to this line of reasoning. Other people argue that instead of consciousness, it's memory, right? It's memory that ties together your personal identity. And while we're at it, Hume offers a refutation of that as well. because of course we have a lack of continuous memory. If identity is supposed to be continuous, well then, and identity is memory, well then our memory ought to be continuous. However, it is not. Just try and remember. I mean, do you remember everything from when you were 7? How about 17, right? I mean, it doesn't really matter what year it was or how long ago. You don't have a year's worth of continuous memories, much less an entire lifetimes of continuous memories. I bet none of you even remember exactly what you had for lunch 2 weeks ago. Now, maybe if it was a special occasion, you might, but okay, how about the day before that? Right? It gets pretty tough, right? There's all kinds of gaps, and we actually, when you take stock of everything you actually remember, you remember almost nothing of your whole life. And so if we are a memory, we're not as much as we thought. Right. So these are Hume's objections to Locke's view, and this is really all the text gives us about personal identity. They give us a particular kind of psychological identity, and then they give us a refutation of it. They don't really fully explore the topic. They don't go into things like bodily identity, etc. But that's the way it is, and so that's their treatment of personal identity. And so we get sort of one argument for a particular view, and then we get an argument against that view. And then the text is going to move on, and so shall we, to talk about the philosophy of mind. And so that'll do it for theories of identity. Again, what we get is just a presentation of a psychological theory of identity and a refutation of a psychological theory of identity, the first from Locke, the second from Hume. Now, the text also covers issues in terms of theories of mind, that is, ideas about what a mind is. Right? And so let's start with the one the text starts with, because in some ways it's the chronological forebear. That is a view that is known as substance dualism, sometimes just dualism. Right? This position, substance dualism, is advocated by Descartes. He's a Frenchman, so the French put a lot of silent letters in their spellings of things. The reason they do this is so that then, if you mispronounce it, they can be snooty about it. Nobody's better at being snooty about their language than the French. But of course, this dualist position is very old in many human cultures. Lots of ancient peoples are dualists. Plato is no exception. He's a very famous dualist. And so the whole position, what the position actually says, is really easily remembered by breaking down its name. Now, this is something I don't think I've mentioned before, but I will mention it now. Philosophers are really, really, really good at naming things. Okay, so for example, the theory that people are their psychology, that is, that their identity is grounded by their psychology, is called the psychological identity theory. Very straightforward. It tells you exactly what the view is. The view that people are their bodies is the bodily identity theory, right? And so, very straightforward once again. And so, substance dualism, great name for it. If you break down the name, you know exactly what the view is. This is to be contrasted with people like physicists. Physicists are terrible at naming things. So if you consider, like, say, the Big Bang, you would assume that it would be a big, right, when in fact it was not. It was infinitesimally small, or that it would be a bang, and it technically was not a bang either. A black hole is neither black in any real sense nor a hole. Dark matter is neither dark in any real sense, nor is it matter in any conventional sense. So again, physicists really need to shape up their naming game here. Maybe take a cue from the philosophers, be a little bit more straightforward, name things what they really mean. So substance dualism. A substance is a stuff, right? That's a technical term. Dual refers to two. And so if you put it together, substance dualism, the ism means it's a view, the view that, right? Uh, it's the two stuffs view, or the view that there are two stuffs. Okay, that's substance dualism. Now, the text here spends a little bit of time sort of alluding to, sort of hinting at how Descartes actually arrives at his substance dualism. But again, this is something I'm not very happy with them about. I don't think they give you the story. I mean, they could just have you read the first Descartes' first meditation. He wrote this collection called Meditations on First Philosophy, some of which is quoted in the text. But really, they should have just had you read the entire first meditation. It's only like 3 pages, and it really gives you all the background of what he does, why he's doing it, and where he goes to after he does. And so I'll take the liberty of doing that because I think it's important to understand how he got to where he got, because his view is kind of our jumping off point. We all start by talking about Descartes' view, and then based on its problems, we start talking about other views. So it's, again, worth understanding how Descartes got where he got. So first off, he starts with this general skeptical project. Okay, skepticism, right, is in philosophy, it's the view that it's really taking very seriously the idea that you might be wrong, and that's how Descartes comes to this, because he says, look, I've been wrong about things before, right? It only takes so much time on this planet before you start to realize that you've been wrong about certain things, and so if you've been wrong about one thing, it stands to reason you could be wrong about another. And if you're wrong about a couple of things, it stands to be a reason that you could be wrong about a lot more. And so he says, look, doubtless, my mind is chock full of false beliefs or beliefs that I don't have a good enough reason to have. Problem is that they all hide, right? If I knew which beliefs they were, I wouldn't believe them anymore. If I knew which ones were false or if I knew which ones were really dubious. And so what he wants to do is he wants to essentially sort of, ditch them all and only keep the ones that he has some good reason for keeping. Right, that's his general method, and so he thinks that the ones that are just really certain, that have this really high level of certainty to them, those are the things that he can build up everything out of. The first thing he does say, all right, says, all right, where do we get all of our beliefs, right? So what are the sources for my beliefs? So maybe I can examine the sources, and if I find something that's not quite certain in one of these sources, well, then I can just ditch that whole family of beliefs, and then I'll be well on my way. And whatever's left from this idea of finding, sort of nitpicking, picking at my ideas, whatever's left ought to be pretty good, right? That's what he says. Sensible kind of a project. And so he starts off saying, look, I guess everything I know pretty much comes from or through my senses, right? If you ask people, where do you learn things from? They'll say, oh, their parents. You say, back up a second. How do you learn things from your parents? Say, oh, well, you have to see things that they do. You have to hear the things that they say. Ultimately, this is filtered through the senses. And of course, not only pushes the problem back, where did your parents learn anything from? Look, at some point, somebody has to look around and see things and listen and hear things and feel things and smell them. And those are the kinds of things that then we build everything else out of. And so it seems like at base, everything really comes from the senses. That's Descartes' sort of central insight here. And he says, now, can I trust that? Is it a very good place to get beliefs from, or do I have to throw all that away because it's not the kind of certainty that I'm looking for? And so the first thing he does is he says, well, okay, check this out. I mean, obviously, my senses have fooled me from time to time. They sometimes simply get it wrong. You put a straw in a glass of, drinking in a glass of water, and it looks like it bends, right? Well, it doesn't. It just looks like it does. You stand on some railroad tracks, and they look like they converge in the distance, but they don't. You're driving along. You thought you saw something, and you didn't, right? Or you thought somebody said something, and they said something else, right? I mean, that happens all the time. And so he says it would be the height of foolishness to just trust something when I know it has deceived me before. At least absolutely trust it, right? And so there's at least this room for doubt that creeps in because we know sometimes our senses get it wrong. And that means that we're unlikely to be able to know for sure when our senses are getting it wrong and when they're getting it right. That's his argument from illusion. Now, that would have been interesting as an argument had he stopped there. But what makes his writing really good philosophy is that he didn't stop there. He says, okay, there's an argument, and that might be a good reason to doubt things that come from my senses. But is that argument even very good? Right? So he doubts his own doubt. Okay, that's what makes this good philosophy. What makes it good philosophy is that he maintains his critical approach even to his own arguments, right? Especially to his own arguments. And so he says, all right, There might be plenty of things that are off in the distance, or they're small, or they're fleeting that I wasn't paying direct attention to. Sure, those are the kinds of situations in which my senses get it wrong. There's all kinds of things where I don't even imagine that my senses could have gotten it wrong. And so the example he gives, like, here I am sitting in a chair in front of the fire in my winter dressing gown holding a piece of paper. These aren't the kinds of things that our senses fool us about, right? That we're mistaken about. So maybe there's lots of things that our senses get perfectly well. That's his response to his argument from illusion. He's skeptical even of his response. Right? Says, oh, except that that response fails in a different way. This is where he comes up with what is called by later scholars his famous Hume argument. And he says, look, I guess there's all kinds of things that I don't normally doubt about my senses or what my senses are telling me, like here I am sitting in this chair. But I've had plenty of dreams where what I thought was happening in the dream was something I really thought was happening. And here he's talking about non-genuine sensory experience. That is, times when we think we're having a sensory experience, but we are not, right? And so those are the kinds of things where if the only reason you believe something is because you dreamed it happened, well, you don't really have good enough reason to believe that thing. Okay. So he says if I'm, dreaming that I was, riding on a giant beetle and, the person next to me was my brother, he didn't look anything like my brother, but I knew he was my brother, and then yada, 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 right? I mean, dreams can get really bizarre. And for a little while, they're entirely convincing, right? And he says that for all I know, that could be right now, right? And I could wake up and be like, "Whoa, what a weird dream. I dreamt I was, sort of sitting here and writing." Um, But that's the idea. That's the dream argument. It's the idea that and dreams are one example of a non-genuine sensory experience, but they're not the only one. Things like hallucinations are also fall under that bill. Sort of direct brain stimulation in some various weird ways all fall under the dream argument. They're sort of non-genuine sensory experiences. You think you're seeing something, but you're not actually seeing it. Okay, that's the difference between seeing something in a dream and actually seeing it. And so he says that a lot of what he's very confident about could be non-genuine. Now, of course, he responds even to this argument. He says, "Yeah, yeah, but even when I'm dreaming, there seem to be truths of reason." Right? This is where he tries to go beyond the senses. He says, "Okay, aside from my senses, there are certain things that are rationally necessary." He says, "I don't even think I could dream that 2 plus 3 is anything except for 5." Now that's debatable. Who knows, right? But Descartes doesn't think he can imagine that. So he says, all right. So even the dream argument doesn't take that out of the equation, and it doesn't. I don't invent things entirely for the dreams. I have to get those experiences from somewhere, and they should be from the senses. So the senses give me something, but maybe just not certainty. He says that even reason though seems to give him certainty. He's certain that 2 plus 3 equals 5 anywhere, even in a dream. And so, in order to sort of complete his skeptical project, he sort of imagines a further kind of an argument. He says, imagine this. Imagine there's this evil demon who enjoys nothing better than deceiving me, and he is perhaps all powerful or very, very powerful. Now, he imagined an evil demon and some with sort of magical powers. You could imagine some very advanced alien with sort of super great mind control. It doesn't really matter. The argument's the same. The idea is if there was such a thing, you couldn't be sure that there wasn't, and it could presumably fool you about the sum of 2 and 5, right? It could make you very certain that 2 plus 3 is 5, even if it wasn't. And of course, the demon would just laugh and think it was the funniest thing in the world. Just loves deceiving humans, right? And so Descartes says, look, if that's the case, I guess he wants to say there's just no piece of knowledge that's incapable of being doubted in some way, right? And it's that last argument, that argument about the evil demon or the evil genius, depending on how you translate the work. That's the one that finally sort of does him in, right? So, okay, look, I'm going to doubt everything, except he thinks for one thing. The only thing he thinks he can't doubt is that he exists. And so he comes up with this famous phrase, cogito ergo sum, right? And this is what's called cogito, right? Or the people pronounce it the modern sophagy. The Romans would have pronounced it cogito. But this cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Cogito is the Latin word for I think. And so the cogito is this last move that he makes in his first meditation, where he says, "Look, if I am being deceived, I have to exist in order to be deceived. So even if I'm being deceived about everything, I can't be deceived about existing, right?" Now, if he's doubting the very exercise of reason, then of course maybe he can doubt it. It makes as much sense to say I don't have to exist in order to be deceived as it does to say I can be deceived about 2 plus 3 equaling 5. So in any case, right, that's where he ends up. He ends up in this place where all he can be certain of is that he exists. And so then he starts turning his attention to, all right, so what is it about this idea that makes it so clear and distinct? And then maybe other ideas are also just as clear and distinct, or clear and distinct in similar ways, and so we can build up something from those. That's his essential approach. Now, the general consensus is that it fails miserably. He raises some beautiful questions, has a very impeccable philosophical method, but once he starts really trying to get himself out of the trouble he's gotten himself into, he's very unsuccessful. Um, and so that's where we're going to go from here. So Descartes is left with this view where the only thing he can be certain of is that he exists, really nothing else. This is a view known as solipsism, this belief that only the self exists and you can't be certain of anything else. You can't even be sure what the self is, And so, but then again, that's the question he turns us to. He's like, if I must exist, what kind of thing am I? And he says, well, here's the thing that must exist. I'm a thinking thing, right? This essential thing. I am a thinking thing, right? Because that's what has to be the case in order to be deceived, right? You have to be thinking in order to be deceived, and that's all, right? So he says, at the very least, I must be a thinking thing, right? That's the core or my essence, and that's how he gets there. And so then he says, essentially, he defines a human as something like this. He says, look, there's physical stuff, right, which is the stuff of the universe. It's otherwise known as matter, and then there's also mind stuff, the stuff that's responsible for the thinking. And so physical stuff or matter is what objects and bodies are made out of, right? So your arms and your legs, and they're made of like matter, physical stuff, same as the ground, the stars and whatever, all matter. The essential property of matter is extension. It all takes up space. And mind stuff, okay, is not made out of matter. Its essential property is ideation or perception, or depending on how you want to translate his work again. Um, and so, mind stuff is what's responsible for all this perceiving, and it's not made of matter. It's a fundamentally different stuff. Remember, this is the two stuffs view, the substance dualist view. So the substance dualist view, again, that's probably the view that if you really sort of poke people on the street and sort of ask them questions about themselves or what they think they are or what they think that minds are, that's very often the kind of view that people will talk as if they believe. Now, it's my hope that by the time we're done here, you won't think that anymore, because the view really is tremendously problematic at an intellectual level, right? It's one of those things that only holds up until you think about it for about 5 minutes. And so, the biggest problem with substance dualism, and a problem look, Descartes knew of this problem and tried to get around it, but again, the consensus is he was not successful. Okay, so here's the mind-body problem. This is the biggest problem with the substance dualist view, which again is a very old view. It begins with the fact of mind-body interaction. And here's what I mean by the fact of mind-body interaction. We just know, we have really good evidence that minds and bodies interact. Okay? So we know that, for example, bodies have effects on minds. Okay? So just kick something. Now, did you feel yourself kick it? There you go. Okay, you have a body doing something that your mind then is affected by. Right? Go the other way. Wave your hand in the air. There you go. Minds affect bodies. Okay, if you decide to wave your hand, you wave your hand. Okay, that's the fact of mind-body interaction. Minds interact with bodies. Bodies interact with minds. Okay. Now the problem is when we try and explain how entirely non-material things, that is, things that are not matter, right, interact with things that are matter. Because matter, as far as we know, follows material principles or physical laws. And so we don't, you don't have, for example, you imagine a billiard ball, and if you think to yourself, oh, come on, billiard ball, move. Well, of course it's not going to. And so if you don't think that, that you can just sort of think the billiard ball into moving, why should you think that that's what's going on with your own hand? It's made out of matter too. Why should you just think it moving, right? And so really the explanation that most people have of the difference between a billiard ball and your hand is that your hand is physically connected by nerve endings and to your brain. Okay, like you explain all of this by appealing to things that matter does, where there's no material connection between your brain really and the billiard ball. Okay, and so again, we want to try and explain how something that is entirely non-material, that such as the mind, like Descartes says it is, interacts with material things. How does it cause a physical action, and how does physical action cause anything in it, right? Now, really, let's take the time to try and answer this, right? Take a minute. I'm going to give you a sort of a moment of silence. Try and think of some kind of answer to this. How does that go? Okay, I hope you've called out a few answers, maybe written down a few answers, got at least something in mind here. Here are some of the very common answers I get when I do this in a face-to-face class. So one of the things people say is they'll say, well, look, we've got like neurons that do all sorts of things, right? They have like chemical signals or something like that 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 they sort of they neurons fire, and that's what causes our that's how our bodies interact with our minds. Well, think about this for a second, right? Neurons are physical things. They are made of matter and they manipulate matter, right? Chemistry is all about matter. Chemical signals are all material, made of matter, following physical law. Okay? So neurons is not the answer, right? They don't explain how physical things can interact with non-physical things. They only appeal to how physical things interact with other physical things. So another time people say, well, what are like the electrical signals that we have that are in our brain, right? Well, electricity, again, is a property of matter, right? It's about the movement of electrons, which are a piece of matter. They're a very tiny piece of matter, but they are matter nonetheless. They follow physical law. So then things start to get pretty creative. People various kinds of special physics. And so most often people say, well, is it like some kind of quantum thing? Now, Hollywood screenwriters and sort of ordinary people on the street oftentimes sort of wave their arms, say the word quantum, and then that's supposed to sort of explain anything. Well, notice that doesn't actually explain anything. But of course, quantum features or quantum phenomena are all actually physical. Those are all properties of matter that are studied by, that are studied by materialists, right? And so again, un- unless there's a very specific thing that you mean by special physics, that's not going to get you out of it, right? And so if you mean sort of like some physics that's not that well understood, well, look, if it's physics, it's still physics, right? It's still entirely about the properties of material things. You're not bringing in the interaction between the material and the entirely non-material. Okay. The idea is that how can things interact while still being entirely distinct, as in still being two different substances, fundamentally different substances. Okay? So there's actually only one answer that makes any degree of sense, but you'll see that it's not a very good answer for all that. Right? There's only one way to say what explains how entirely non-material things interact with material things and vice versa. How do material things interact with entirely non-material things? Now, the answer to this, again, try to think of the answer here. I'll give you a bit of a moment of silence. And it's one of those where the answer is so easy and obvious that it's kind of hard to come up with. But I'll give you a few seconds. See if you can think about it. Maybe write it down or start screaming at your screen. Oh no, I know, it's this, it's this, it's this. Okay, well, there it is. Magic, right? Now, I mean, I'm not trying to be flippant here. Uh, But look, if a theory, if the only way to explain how the theory works is magic, it's just not a very good theory. So, by the way, Descartes recognized that the mind-body problem was a seriously bad problem. And so he did, in fact, try to exercise a solution to that problem. So here was his solution. His proposal was that the pineal gland is the seat of the soul. The pineal gland, you say? What's that? Well, this is a sort of a cutaway diagram of a human brain. So you see the skull, the brain, the nasal cavity, all that sort of stuff. The pineal gland is a little gland, sort of right in the middle. Um, and it's a small gland that does a number of things, as far as we know. One of the important things that it does is it influences our circadian rhythms. That is, we sort of tend to be more awake and alert when it's light outside, and we tend to be more sleepy when it's dark. Okay, that's partially the responsibility of the pineal gland and some of the hormones that it's sort of secretes and handles and all that sort of stuff. But well, you might say, okay, why the pineal gland, right? What's up with this, Descartes? Okay, well here's why. So for one thing, uh, it's kind of in the middle of the head, right? If you see the diagram, you see that that's where it's kind of in the, no, it's not the exact center by either weight or by geometry, but it's kind of in the middle. Well, that's got to be important, right? Middles are important things, and so if it's in the middle, that means it's doing something really critical. Well, not necessarily, right? Your center of mass is probably somewhere in your intestines, and yeah, your intestines are important, but one little piece of your intestine is not likely to be, any important than the rest of you. So again, there's no sense that just because something's in the middle of something, it has to be, important in any real way, right? That's just not. There's no necessity there. Also, the pineal gland is kind of spherical, right? And there's this view that spheres, these sort of perfect round balls, that's important, right? It's important if things be spherical. It's a kind of perfect shape. It signifies something, right? Does it really, right? So say something is spherical. Who cares, right? Marbles are all spherical. Does that mean that they all have souls? It's no. And in fact, the pineal gland isn't really spherical. It's only kind of spherical. It's really a little bit more sort of pine cone shaped. Um, but again, there it is. Also, the pineal gland has no bilateral, or at least it was believed at the time to have no bilateral symmetry. That is, it doesn't have a left half and a right half. Pretty much everything in the brain has a left half and a right half, right? That sort of match each other. It looks like they're kind of stuck together in the middle. Well, that looks kind of imperfect, but the pineal gland looks like it's just one unit. It's one round thing, right? That doesn't look like it has any bilateral symmetry. Again, that's got to be important, right? It's the singular thing, right? It's not. Doesn't have any other structure to speak of. As a matter of fact, it actually does have bilateral symmetry. It does have a left half and a right half. It's just that it's not obvious that it does. So there that goes. And so actually, Descartes' solution to the mind-body problem has inspired a lot of really bizarre views that people have to this day, centering around the pineal gland. A lot of sort of new age pseudoscience having to do with it. So a Google image search will give you at least this one, right? It'll talk about all these similarities between the cross section of the brain showing the pineal gland and the Eye of Ra, which is an ancient Egyptian symbol. Um, Again, who really cares, right? If there's some symbol, but I mean, look, uh, symbols are bound to look like something else. So that's the idea. They're like, oh no, that must be, So people talk about like the third eye or sort of decalcifying or activating your pineal gland or something. It's pseudoscientific. It's full honky. Uh, but anyway, a lot of that's Descartes' fault. But here's some problems with Descartes' solution, and if those problems weren't already obvious, we're going to go ahead and make them obvious. Well, look, the pineal gland is made out of matter, just as much as neurons are, just as much as electricity is. And so it can't do anything to solve the problem. It just pushes the problem back. You say, okay, how do, you want to say, uh, how do physical things affect non physical things and vice versa? You say, oh, it's the pineal gland. You want to say, look, the pineal gland is a physical thing. How does it affect something that's non physical? And how does something that's non physical affect it? And so again, it obviously does not solve the problem, and it's almost laughably bad as a solution. So here are a couple of ways out of the mind-body problem, if you want out of the mind-body problem. One way out is to deny that there is any matter. Okay, this means that you just no longer have a dualist view. You have one or another kind of a monist view, a substance monism. That is, there's only one substance. And if you're going to pick one, you might as well pick the mind stuff. Okay, yeah, this is the view that there is only mind stuff. That's the only thing that actually exists. All of what we thought was matter, we're wrong about that. Or you can go the other way. You can say, all right, so there, because what generates the problem is the dualism itself, the saying they're two fundamentally distinct substances. Well, if you say, all right, fine, there's only one substance, and that's matter. Matter is the only substance that there is. There is no mind stuff. There is no immaterial stuff. A lot of times people call mind stuff a soul. Maybe that's what you mean by a soul, maybe it isn't. But if you mean this immaterial thing that's responsible for your consciousness, this applies to that view, right? So another way out of the mind body problem that substance dualism has is to say, well, there's no mind stuff, right? There's only matter. Now, both of these views have a kind of challenge, have a kind of difficulty with them. The challenge of view number one is to try and explain matter using only mind stuff, various material properties, right? For example, why does matter work the way it works if there's only mind stuff? Why can we control some things by thinking about them, like, say, our own bodies, but not other things, like mountains or billiard balls, using only our minds? Why can you leave something on a table, leave the room, have nobody be in there, then have somebody else go back in, and then come out and describe what was on the table? So, why do things look like they're part of a permanent external world if there isn't any external world, right? If there's only mind stuff? Now, the one person that sort of proposed this kind of a view, this sort of super idealist view, is a guy named George Berkeley, who I mentioned earlier. And he doesn't do it all that seriously. He sort of does it just to explore some of the problems with our views about matter, right? But that's one particular place you can look at this kind of a view. I will say it's not the most popular solution, but it is a solution to the mind-body problem. It does help you get around it. You say, okay, fine, there are no bodies, so now we don't have to explain how minds and bodies interact. Now, minds and minds simply interact. Ideas interact with ideas, and that's what we got. So, but its challenge, of course, is trying to explain why it sure looks like there's matter and material properties. So the challenge for this second view, this view that we said simply this where we deny that there is any mind stuff, and say, look, there's only matter, is to explain minds and mental states, that is, psychological properties, using only matter. We want to say, look, it's what we mean by, when somebody's thinking about baseball, is that there's some kind of matter interacting with some kind of matter in some sort of a way, even if that way is very, very complex. Uh, we're still only talking about matter, right? We're still only talking about physical stuff. So there are a lot of, again, popular approaches to doing that. I will say this second approach has been more, uh, very much more commonly adopted than the first. And in fact, one of the views that we're going to look at, our first sort of alternate view of what a mind is this the view of Gilbert Ryle. It's a photograph of Gilbert Ryle during his life. Ryle argues that dualism arises from a kind of category mistake. This is yet another argument against substance dualism. And so let's talk a little bit about what he means by a category mistake, because it's a very crucial part of his view. A category mistake, he gives a couple of examples to illustrate what it is something like this: assuming that the parade is something over and above the bands, floats, and the balloons, right? So if you go and you say, well, I saw these bands march by, and then I saw these floats, and I saw these balloons, and they all went by, but where's the parade, right? People would say, you've made a kind of mistake there, right? You've assumed that the parade is something over and above all that, instead of, no, 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 all of that stuff, that is the parade, okay? And the one described in the text, the example in the text is, assume that you show somebody around the university, you take them to a couple of classes, you show them some professors, you have them meet some students, you have them look at the buildings, etc., right? And they say, okay, that's all fine and good, but where's the university? Right? You'd say, no, 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 you're making a mistake in assuming that the university is something over and above all of that stuff, the buildings, the students, the classes, and all that stuff. No, no, all that stuff, that's the university. There's nothing over and above other than what you've seen. So that is that a university is an abstraction, right, that ranges over buildings, students, classes, and other sorts of observable things. A parade is an abstraction that refers to this collection of bands, floats, and balloons. So he's going to take a very similar kind of view with the mind. He says the mind is nothing over and above all of a person's observed behaviors. He says all of the stuff you see people do and hear them say, that's what a mind is. There's nothing else. There's nothing more, right? And so this view is known as, what he called it, logical behaviorism, to describe it, to distinguish it from other subtly similar kinds of behaviorism. We'll just call it behaviorism here. But that's why his view is called behaviorism. It's the view that the mind is just a set of behaviors. That's all. There's nothing over and above the behaviors that is the mind. The behaviors are the mind. That's all there is to see, folks. Now, of course, as with all views, there are some problems to Ryle's view. There are some arguments against his view. And so one of the more fun ones, of course, the text mentions some that are in this vein. Specifically, the problem about describing headaches, for example, is one of the ones they so. But behaviorists got this challenge from Daniel Dennett, right? And so this is who comes up with this challenge to behaviorism. And so the idea is, if a mind is just behavior, so that's all there is, okay, and there's nothing over and above that, and there's nothing beyond those behaviors, imagine you need surgery. Okay, this is how the counter argument goes. And so, for example, say a kidney transplant, like a really major thing where they got to dig in you and do all kinds of crazy stuff. All right. So you could undergo the operation with a conventional anesthesia. That's where they knock you completely out and then do the operation and then wake you up after it's all over. Or you could use two fictitious medications. Again, the medications are invented just for the sake of argument. This is what we now call a thought experiment. It illustrates a problem with a particular view. So one of these two fictitious medications is called curare. And curare just immobilizes you. It makes you unable to move, but it lets you experience the entire operation. Right? You feel everything. You hear the surgeons talking to each other. You feel the knife cuts. You feel your kidneys being yanked around, and cut up, and all. I mean, just it seems like a nightmare of an experience to me. But you do experience it, and you just can't move the whole time. And then, after you're done with the operation, after they sew you back up and everything's all cool, then you take the second drug called amnestic, which makes you forget the whole experience. And so, if you think about somebody who did a surgery after one method that is conventional anesthesia, and after this other method, this curare plus amnestic method, you would have to say, based on their behaviors, that there was no difference between the two methods. And so it would be irrational of you, superstitious even, to choose one method over the other. They'd both be equally good because they'd both lead to the same behaviors after it was all over. And so the point is that it seems like nobody in their right mind would go for the curare plus amnestic option, even though your behaviors after it was all over would be the same as if you'd done, the conventional anesthesia. The idea is you want to save yourself a bunch of bad experiences, even if you don't remember them after they're over, by just simply doing the general, the common anesthesia, the usual kind. So that means that there's something other than behaviors working on here. In a sense, behaviorism just leaves out our inner lives, our own experiences of our own mental states and what it's like to have them. And that's the biggest, most obvious problem with various versions of behaviorism. And it's probably enough to refute the view. So the second major type of physicalist or materialist theory that our textbook covers is what's known as eliminative materialism. And the person it mentions in connection with this view is one Paul Churchland. That is the fellow on the right over there, the human, not the dog. And he's the one mentioned and quoted by your text in connection with this view. The The person photographed on the left, the human, not the dog, is one Patricia Churchland, that's his wife. And honestly, she's written just as much about eliminative materialism as Paul has, and they've written quite a number of things together. And so I thought it sort of odd that one of them be mentioned and not the other, so that's been remedied now. So in any case, eliminative materialism is another kind of, again, materialist view. Again, philosophers are very good at naming things, and so the name eliminative materialism should tell you just pretty much exactly what it says. So materialism, okay, it's a view that there's only matter, right? And this is, again, one way out of the mind-body problem. One way out of it is to deny that there's any mind stuff, right? To say there's just matter. The other way is to say there's no matter, there's just mind stuff, right? Those are really the available ways out of the mind-body problem. And most take the latter way, right? Thinking it's a little easier to explain how we have mental states given that we have matter rather than the other way around. And so materialism, that's we're familiar with that so far. And it's the eliminative part that takes a little bit of explanation. But first off, let's go through some of the basics of the view. And really, eliminative materialism is properly a combination between several different views that exist in the philosophy of mind. And I should mention here that there are many, many hundreds of different and distinct theories of mind. There are a few broad families of theories of mind, but a bunch of very specific ones. And the ones that the text selects are just fine. They're cool. They're great. It's a reasonably representative sample. But just know that there are many, many more that the text does not name. But back to eliminative materialism. The first element of it is, of course, materialism or physicalism. They come down to the same thing. The second is that mental states are brain states. Okay, this is a view known as the mind-brain identity theory. Now, don't confuse this with personal identity. Yes, it uses the word identity, but it's all the other words are different. So personal identity is a theory about what makes a person the same over time and through change. The mind-brain identity theory refers to the idea that minds and brains are identical, that is, they are the same thing. When you are talking about your mind, you are really just talking about your brain. And when you are talking about your brain, you are talking about your mind. That's what the mind-brain identity theory states, and that's a view that the Churchlands do advocate, and many others as well. The other thing, another view that they advocate, is the view that folk psychology is false, and perhaps even radically false. We'll talk a little bit more in the future slides about the notion of folk psychology, but here we'll simply say that part of eliminative materialism is the view that our folk psychological theory or our folk psychology is false and perhaps radically so. And this is where we get to the eliminative part of eliminative materialism. The idea is this, that as we learn more about the way that brains work, most of the way that we talk about our mental states, our hopes, our fears, our desires, and all that sort of stuff, the words we use or the way that we use them, or certainly the way that we define those words, will change to reflect what we have learned about the way that brains work. Much as the way that we talk about the weather has changed and to some extent been completely revamped in the wake of a better understanding of modern physics or modern meteorology. For example, we no longer talk about thunder as being something like, I remember when I was a kid, it was angels bowling, or it was the wrath of the gods in earlier times or something like that. No. It's a sonic shock from a bolt of lightning, right? That's how we now define thunder. We still use the word, but its definition is entirely different because we have a different understanding of what it is. So folk meteorology and actual meteorology are very different, and the folk meteorology is mostly just false. And so this is the Churchland's hunch. And it's no more than that at this point. It's a hunch, right? And it's got some solid historical parallels, but this is one of those things where only time will tell. And the Churchlands have sort of put their money on elimination, right? They think that the language of neuroscience will sort of take over and replace our folk psychological language. Okay, now the most interesting part of this view, eliminative materialism, has to do with the role of folk psychology. Now, I said on the last slide that we would talk a little bit more about that in future slides. Well, this is a future slide, and so we'll talk more about that. Here's what folk psychology is. Folk psychology is the ordinary way we talk about psychology. And I mentioned in the last slide a parallel between with, say, folk meteorology, right? People talk about various things. We also have other sorts of folk theories. Again, these are the sorts of theories that people have before they really learn very much about something. So, for example, in folk physics, we have the idea that heat comes out of wood because or wood burns because there's heat trapped in it that just sort of can be induced to come out, right? Well, we don't talk that way anymore because we just don't think it's true that there's just heat trapped in wood, right? We have a different understanding of the way that of what combustion is. There used to be in biology this concept of an élan vital, right? This sort of life force that was in stuff that was alive. And we don't talk that way anymore. Again, that's sort of folk biology. And it makes a certain kind of sense, but as we learn more about things, we say, okay, no, there's not like a thing like this substance, right? This élan vital that just sort of makes that makes stuff alive. Rather, we have various different, more or less functional definitions of what makes something alive. The best of which I've heard is living things resist thermal equilibrium longer than you'd think they would, right? That's kind of a clever, cheeky definition. And if you don't quite understand that, look up thermodynamics and various other things. But in any case, there is this concept of sort of our folk beliefs, right? The sort of beliefs that we come up with before we learn a lot about something, and then we generally replace those all of the those ways of talking and ways of thinking with other things when we know better, when we learn better. And so the idea is that we do all kinds of things in terms of folk psychology. That is, we describe people's desires, their beliefs, their hunches. We say, oh, this person, really is hungry for a taco, and they think that there's one north of here, so that's why they're walking north, right? Notice that's a way of explaining why somebody does something using features of their psychology. And now, of course, all of that language is a kind of folk psychology. Psychology as an empirical science is really very young, and certainly neuroscience is in its very infancy. And so the argument is something like this, right? That the track of folk psychology, according to the Churchlands, will parallel something like the track of folk physics, which has largely been abandoned and really a long time ago. So I think eventually, as we get a better understanding of neuroscience, we'll simply abandon the way that we currently talk, or at least radically redefine it. We may use some of the same words, but we just maybe there's some of the same names for things, but we don't really have the same understanding of them. We'll replace all that. So one particular story, which again, Dennett's popping up all over here, but he's written a lot in a lot of really good stuff in these particular parts of the unit. And so Dennett gives us really a great example of what he calls fatigues, right? And so this is a kind of illustration about how eliminative materialism might work or might not work. And so he just asks us to imagine there's this community of people, again, just some fictitious community of people. Again, here we've got a thought experiment. And these people talk about fatigues, right? The idea is that their explanation of why people get tired is that there's a thing called a fatigue that builds up in the body, right? That there are these concrete things called fatigues, and that's what makes people tired. It's when the fatigues build up. Look, it makes a certain kind of sense. And so you can imagine their sports lore, and like sportscasters and stuff like that, saying things like, "Well, he's built up a lot of fatigue, so let's see how many he can still hold," right? To say, someone's getting tired, and we'll see how long they can keep things going. Or you might say, "Boy, a fatigue in the legs is worth two in the arms," or something like that. Whereas, your lower body fatigue will affect you a lot more than upper body fatigue, something like that, right? And so just imagine this is the way they talk. And now they've got somebody who comes in who's, has something like our modern understanding of anatomy and physiology that talks about sort of lactic acid buildup and talks about the muscular cells running out of sugars and, and various other things that keep them going. And all of the stuff that we sort of associate with a loss of muscular energy or physical fatigue. And, then they say, okay, so you've got all this big story here. What are fatigues then? And the physician tries to tell them, no. There's no actual, there's no such thing as fatigues, right? And now, on the one hand, they could say, "What? You don't think there are any fatigues? Go run around the block a couple of times. Come back and tell me there aren't fatigues," right? And I think we can understand the perspective of both sides here, and that's why it's a very interesting kind of an illustration. On the one hand, we can see the physician's really correct here. There are no such things as fatigues, the way that these people use the word. And so one would assume that at some point, right, they would, when talking, at least in a more technical way, replace their word fatigues with something else, or at least when they talk about fatigues, realizes it's only really just a figure of speech. On the other hand, you can see that they have a point here in that they can explain a lot by appealing to fatigues, even if no such thing literally exists. And so their sort of folk physiology is actually pretty effective. And so Dennett's hunch is that there are plenty of parts of our folk psychology that are actually pretty effective, and that we need not redefine those terms or lose those terms as we learn more about neuroscience or psychology. So again, it's an interesting illustration that gives a rise to some of the issues at play here. In any case, whatever the result of our folk psychology over time, one of a couple of it doesn't really affect the major issue. The major issue here is what eliminative materialism says about the nature of minds. In this case, it's the mind-brain identity theory that's going to be of most interest to us, because that will be the jumping off point for the next thing we'll end up talking about. So the next thing I'd like to talk about then is the last thing that the textbook covers. It's a view called functionalism. And so here we've got this fun little Rube Goldberg cartoon. I really love these things. You should look up any number of them. They're all pretty funny and amusing. So a Rube Goldberg machine is a machine for taking really elaborately complex steps in order to do something very simple. And so this is just one sort of very elaborate way of wiping your mustache after you take a sip of your soup. So in any case, you'll see the parallel here in a minute. But I wanted to say where functionalism comes from. So we started with this dualist view, and we saw that it had this really, really horrible problem. And so we decided, well, look, we can either abandon matter or we can abandon mind stuff. And for the sake of argument, we decided to go ahead and abandon mind stuff. And we get a theory like Ryle's, which is interesting and presents us with yet another problem that dualism has. But of course, it has a problem. It doesn't seem to account for our inner lives or anything like that. So we may think, well, maybe a different physicalist theory is a better one. And so you look at something like eliminative materialism, and they say, look, minds are just brains. That's what they are. And so that's the view that functionalism responds to. It says, actually, there's a problem with that view that we're going to try and get around. That's where we get functionalism. But first, we need to explain what the view is, and then we can explain what problem of the mind-brain identity theory that it does, in fact, get around. So here is how functionalism works, right? Here are the basic parts of that view. The first major part of functionalism as a view is a thing called multiple realizability. Okay, so again, if you pay attention to the words, you know pretty much what it means. So multiple meaning many, realizability meaning you can make something real, or sort of make something happen in multiple ways, right? That's multiple realizability. So to illustrate this concept, I'd like to use some images here. So look at all these 4 images, which I've very carefully clipped off of the internet. And so think about this. What, physically speaking, do they all have in common? Now, not so fast. Don't answer too fast. You're going to give the wrong answer. Remember, I said physically speaking. So in terms of the parts that they are made of and the way that those parts interact with one another, what do they all have in common? Right. Now, if you said, oh, they all tell time, right? Again, you weren't quite paying attention. I asked, what about the parts that they're made of and the way those parts interact with one another do they have in common? Notice the fact that they tell time is something that's an abstraction, okay? That says nothing about their actual parts. So let's talk about their parts for a second. If you look all the way on the left there, that's a Citizen EcoDrive wristwatch, one of the titanium ones, very nice. So here's the way that works, right? It's made of, it's got a casing, right? It's got these nice metal hands, and it's got being an EcoDrive, it's solar powered, so the sun will use the watch face as a kind of solar panel, and it'll charge a battery. And what that battery will do is make a little piece of quartz wiggle by passing electricity over it. And We know exactly how fast quartz wiggles when you pass electricity over it, and you've got another device there that counts how many wiggles there are. And whenever you get a certain number of wiggles, that's 1 second, and then the second hand advances 1 bit. That's how a quartz movement watch works. Very accurate. And that's, and that's what goes. But there's a series of gears and things like that that actually physically move the hands. Now, of course, there are no physical hands and everything like that. For all I know, this alarm clock may also use a quartz movement. It may also just use a simple digital electric timer, which basically sort of counts the number of clock cycles of a small microprocessor, which is not as accurate as a quartz movement, but it's not too bad. And it's a little cheaper, so probably that. And instead of making hands move, it just simply illuminates a liquid crystal display, right? And so there's the parts themselves are entirely different, right? And the technology used to do what it does is entirely different. In this third image from the left here, you've got what looks like a Motorola phone to me. But you'll notice that it's got a time display. Well, that time display is entirely software. There are no physical parts really at all. I mean, of course, the phone itself is a physical part, and it does have a microprocessor. It does have memory. It's all required to execute a program. But the program itself is what it's really doing. And of course, there's some transmissions to keep the clock accurate, etc. And so it's very different than the previous two. And of course, the one all the way on the right there, that's a sundial. And the sun will cast a shadow on the number of what o'clock it is. At least during the daytime. And so, it's like its physical parts are entirely different than any of those other three. Okay? And so the answer is, what do all these things physically have in common? Well, the answer is nothing. Nothing at all. But notice they all perform the same function, right? This is the sense in which a function is an abstraction. Right? Telling time isn't something that you can smell or see or hear or feel, right? Telling time is a function, and if you look at all these 4 different devices, it's a function that can be done with more than one physical setup. That is, it can be multiply realized. You can make real, the time-telling function with more than one kind of physical setup, right? That's the first and most important feature of the functionalist view, is that it says that multiple realizability is a thing. Right? All right, so now let's talk about what a function is. Right, so a function in philosophy, as in engineering, is the same thing as it is in mathematics. If you have studied functions in your math class, you'll notice, a function is a little machine. It takes an input, right? And it gives you an output. And depending on what function it is, that'll determine what kind of output it gives you from what kind of input. In terms of psychology, we talk about stimulus and response. There's a thing that happens to you and a way that you respond to it. And so the various kinds of functions that our human minds are extremely complex, right? Because the inputs are so complex, the outputs are so complex. But in principle, the view is that mental states are functions. Okay? And the nature of a function is something that takes an input and gives you an output. And so that whenever the inputs are exactly the same, then the outputs are exactly the same. Right now, of course, that rarely happens in our everyday lives, which is why it's so difficult to study minds, is because the second time you give somebody an input, it's different than the first because it's the second time. That is a difference. And so that's, that is what it is. But in any case, complex as it is, this is what at root, at base, the functionalist is committed to, saying that mental states are functions. So when you get a stimulus, you get a response. You touch something hot, you say ouch, and some part of your body pulls away from that thing that's hot. Okay? And so anything that has that kind of response to that kind of stimulus is performing this kind of function. You might call it a kind of very basic damage avoidance function. Sometimes we call it pain. But look, any system, right, that when it comes across something that might damage it, withdraws and exhibits, and withdraws for the reasons that we describe, right? We say, oh yeah, look, I felt this thing that's very, very unpleasant to me, right? I'm conditioned to not like that thing. That's a pain response, no matter what kind of physical thing's involved, right? You can imagine a very fancy prosthetic hand that would use neural signals, like nerve ending signals, that is pain, to signal the brain, hey, I'm being damaged, right? Now, it's unlikely that the metal hand has actual nerves, but that doesn't mean that the pain isn't actual pain, or that the damage avoidance function isn't doing its job, right? So that's the idea, is that you can have multiple realizability even with mental states, right? So imagine that some of you get some kind of a brain disease and some of your neurons start to die. In principle, you could replace those neurons with anything else as long as they did what those neurons do, even if they're not made of what those neurons are made of. That's functionalism. Now, let's circle back for a second and talk about the motivation for functionalism. Remember, the last theory we talked about was eliminative materialism, which was committed to, among other things, the mind-brain identity theory that says that minds just are brains. Right? One of the things the functionalist doesn't like very much about that view is that they think it is too narrow, or the term they often use is chauvinistic, right? That is, that they think it's too narrow to assume that the only thing that has a mind is something that has a human brain, right? Um, and so the functionalist view is a way out of that kind of a chauvinist position, like the brain identity theory. That is, all of the things below, and this is kind of a nerd test if you can identify all of these at a glance and where they come from. I'm sure that most people will at least get two of them, at least the two on the ends there. I think they get a little bit harder on the interior there. The dolphin, I think, is probably the one that's hardest. And I think, in the middle, people, oh, it's an alien. Yes, but which alien from which television series? There's a clue. It's a television series. Actually, three of these are television series, and three of them are motion pictures. So the idea is that, physically speaking, all of these things in the pictures below are different, right? Spock is not human, and so he does not have a human brain. Right? Or there's actually some debate about that, right? So in Star Trek lore, Spock is sort of half human and half Vulcan. But here's the thing: biologically speaking, if two people, right, if two beings, we'll say two creatures, can have fertile offspring with each other, uh, according to biology, that means they are the same species. That is the very definition of being the same species. And so Star Trek has problems with this because they have all sorts of people who are completely different, like species, right? And yet have fertile offspring with each other, which is the very definition of being the same species as somebody else, not a different one. So anyway, but there's Spock there. He's not human. He does not have a human brain. There's this the dolphin Darwin from an ill-fated old television series called Sea Quest. The dolphin was hooked up to a computer that could translate its speech into human speech, but it's not human, right? It clearly has mental states. It thinks, it talks, all that sort of stuff, but just doesn't have a human brain. And of course, the alien in the middle, Thor, the Asgardian from the Stargate television series, also does not have a human brain. Who knows if it has anything resembling a human brain or not? I mean, it does not have a human brain, but yet it talks, it thinks, all that sort of stuff. We have all sorts of evidence it thinks. We have a replicant from the film Blade Runner right next to that. Again, replicant, not human, does not have a human brain. That's something else, but again, clearly still thinks. HAL 9000, the computer that runs the USS Discovery in the film 2001, A Space Odyssey, did have a sequel, 2010, which I think actually was a better movie, although it never will get the kind of critical recognition that the first one got. But it's a computer, right? But it's a very good computer that, maybe the jury's out on whether it thinks or not. I certainly think it does. And but the idea is in principle that could have a mind as well, even though again it lacks a human brain. And then of course you have the adorable sort of Eve and Wally from the very fantastic film of named after one of the characters. Well, again, in principle, right? Even though they don't have brains, they could have minds. Perhaps not the same kinds of minds that you or I have, but minds nonetheless. And of course, there's no reason they couldn't have the same mind as you and I have, as long as whatever they have performs the same function. That's really what all of these things have in common. They're capable of performing at least some of the same functions. And whatever function they do all perform, well, that's multiply realized. That is, the actual physical stuff that you're making the function out of or making the function happen with don't really make any difference. The function is the function. And so this is a theory of mind that is based on a kind of an abstraction. Right? So the mind is an abstraction. The mind is a set of functions. And that set of functions can be performed by any number of physical things. Probably not every possible physical thing, but any number of them. And that's and so it's a response to this view that only a brain, right, could possibly be a mind. And this is a much more expansive thing. So instead of picking a specific physical thing to identify minds with, it says, no, yeah, minds are still physical, right? You have to have something to instantiate the function. Mind really is the function. It's a very subtle kind of a distinction there, but very important, very critical to get that distinction. So just to sum things up a little bit, because it has been pretty long, because there's really quite a lot going on here. There are two big issues that covered in our text. One is the issue of personal identity, and we get one kind of theory about personal identity, a psychological theory, and a response to that psychological theory from Locke and from Hume, respectively. And then we move into the philosophy of mind, which is a different theory, a different set of theories, different set of views, different question. And we start off with the oldest view, right, Descartes' view that really just is the ancient view of minds, and that is a substance dualist view. We see that it has this really, really bad problem, and the only way out of the problem that seems plausible in any way is to opt for a materialist or physicalist view, and we give three of those. One of them is Ryle's behaviorism, which has some problems trying to explain our inner life, or phenomenology as we call it. It's the technical term for all that. So Ryle's view has trouble. And one way out of the trouble that Ryle's view causes is to opt for something like the Churchlands opt for, saying that, look, a mind simply is a brain, right? Of course, the problem with that view is that it may be too narrow, right? It may unnecessarily limit the number of things that could have minds, or it could overly limit what we mean by a mind, or what sorts of things we would say have minds. And that's where you come into functionalism, which says that the mind is a kind of that what mental states are, they're abstractions that describe functions, right? That what a mind really is a set of functions. And so what's important to keep in mind is that there's a progression from one view to another view to another view based on certain kinds of objections or problems. Now, of course, there are problems with functionalism, but we don't really want to go down the rabbit hole. The text doesn't really mention any of those problems. While they're very interesting, and I could go on, because this is actually my area of philosophy. This is the area in which I do most of my reading and research. There's a time when you just have to stop, and that time is now.